Anxiety is something that I've felt for most of my life. Sometimes it stopped me from going outside. I've often struggled to sleep at night, and at points I ain't been eating right. It's a fear that's gripped me deep inside and not let go. I felt like giving up because I lost control, and when the panic attacks got involved, I didn't know what to do. As a teenager, I found it hard to talk about, so nobody knew. I just tried telling myself, I'm not mentally ill or nothing. I'm just struggling to deal with something. And that's what life is. When you hit crisis, you grit your teeth and keep grinding. It's no time for whining like, come on, Nick, you're supposed to be a man. Why are you crying? But honestly, that didn't work for me. My heart would beat so fast that it was hurting me, and the rush of blood to my head would almost turn me burgundy, filled with fear and uncertainty. Going through life, worrying like I'm gonna end up doing nothing with mine. Anxiety hit me like a sharp pain in my chest, and I said to myself that I can't take it again. I'd had enough. So I decided to talk to someone. I felt really embarrassed and didn't know what to say, because lies in my head said that I'm not the same, and exposing this weakness might cause me some pain, like, what if they laugh and tell me, jog on, mate? But they didn't. I spoke and they listened. And for the first time, I felt like I could escape from this prison in which my mind had me living. That's not to say that anxiety just went away and never came again, but I was free from the burden. See, before I was feeling so certain that I was all alone, but now I'm no longer fooled. I know that people care and people can relate. And while it might not be the easiest thing to say, it's important that we start talking. Yeah, it might feel awkward at first, but the more we converse, I'm sure that the talking won't cause any hurt. So I hope you can open up. Look, I know it's tough, and understandably it's something that you don't want to rush. That's fine, take your time. But you ain't got to let it define you, even though it will try to. See, my anxiety would never have let me stand at this stage and ramble away. But I can honestly say that talking with people is part of the reason that I can stand here today. So let's talk about it.
Hi, my name is Nick Brewer. I hope you enjoyed my video that we just watched. We use that video to open our workshops in schools to introduce a topic of mental health and mentoring. I've been pleased to work with Lifeland for many years, and I've also enjoyed mentoring and benefited personally from being mentored. So this evening, you'll hear from Jon Yates, our keynote speaker, our guest panel, including local decision makers and health experts, and some of the young people who have benefited from the Switch program. I would now like to introduce you to Nathan Singleton, the CEO of Lifeline.
Hi, thank you very much, Nick. Appreciate that. Thanks for making the time to come along today. Really got an exciting presentation for you today, and I want to hand straight over to Jon Yates, who's the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund. He's also the co-founder of a number of charities focused on bringing people from all backgrounds together. Jon started his career as a community worker in London Borough of Newham before joining McKinsey Company, where he advised charities, companies, and government on strategy and organisational development. He co-founded The Challenge, the National Citizenship Service, and Head Start. In the UK, these programs now reach 1 in 6 people within their lifetime. So I'm really pleased to have Jon here. Jon also recently authored a book called Fractured, which I'm going to let Jon tell you more about. So Jon, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Nathan, an absolute pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. I should give a sort of a warning about the book. Nathan was telling me that he was listening to it on Audible with his kids in the back of the car. And at some point, I do reveal certain truths about a man who wears a red suit at Christmas time. But I have been informed that the Singleton children did miss that bit. So thankfully, the bit before is sufficiently dull that they tuned out. So excellent. It's really nice to be with you all. I'm going to keep this relatively brief and just say a little bit about the message of the book that I've written, Fractured, which is about why our society has become so divided and what we can do about it. And obviously those divisions also have an impact on levels of anxiety. It's great to hear the work that Nick and Nathan are doing on that. The core argument of Fractured is this, that the average British person is right about something. So half of British people, when polled, say that British society is more divided than it's ever been. 8 out of 10 Americans say that their society is either entirely or mainly divided. And I think they're onto something. And the reason I think they're right is actually quite evident to most of us if we look at our friendship circles. So half of those of us who have been to university in this country have almost no friends who haven't been to university. The vast majority of pensioners in the UK have almost no contact with anyone under the age of 40 unless they're related. A fifth of those who voted to leave the EU and a quarter of those who voted to remain don't have any friends who voted the other way. Half of us have no friends from a different ethnic background. And yet the biggest divide of all in the UK, at least, is income, is class. So a barrister operating in London would have to invite how many people round from their network, how many of their friends, before they invited someone who was unemployed? At 10, 20, 30? They have to invite 100 people before they'd be likely to invite someone who was out of work. We live in these little bubbles. Not all of us, but many of us find ourselves in these little bubbles. Now, the average person, I think, would also say that we've actually quite badly misdiagnosed why this is. Because when I talk to people, they tend to say to me eventually, "Oh, come on, Jon, wasn't it always this way? Don't birds of a feather flock together? Isn't this just natural? People end up surrounded by people who remind them of themselves." And the thing is, they're right. There's a remarkable experiment that was done by a man called Francis Evans in the early 1950s, who decided to follow a load of door-to-door salespeople knocking on doors in the United States of America. One of my first ever jobs was door-to-door sales. And he tracked whether they were successful or they failed in selling life insurance. And what he found was that the seller was more likely to make a sale if the buyer voted the same way that they did. The seller was more likely to make a sale if the buyer earned the same amount of money as they did. The seller was more likely to make a sale if the buyer was the same height as they were. What Francis Evans discovered is that we all have a small bias towards people who remind us of ourselves. 39,000 academic studies have come to the same conclusion. Academics call this homophily, liking the same. I prefer the term people like me syndrome. And it's been found from Kuala Lumpur to Kingston in pretty much every decade that this research has been done. But people like me syndrome, as I said, is a constant small bias. It's small bias, and but it's constant. And so in itself, it can't explain why we've become more divided, because it's a pretty constant bias. In the same way that the sun's heat is pretty constant. And if you said, why is it not so sunny this week when it was more sunny a month ago? And I said, the sun, you'd find that a really sort of unsatisfying answer. Something must have changed in the weather. It can't just be the fact the sun is there, because it's always there. So what's changed that's made us more divided? Well, to understand that, we need to take a trip to Tanzania. On the coast of Lake Eyasi in Tanzania lives a tribe called the Hadza. Now, the Hadza are super interesting. There's about 4,000 members of the Hadza tribe, and they've been living in that part of Tanzania for about 60,000 years. And there's two things that's super interesting about them. The first thing is that they're hunter-gatherers. There aren't many hunter-gatherers left in the world today, but the Hadza are hunter-gatherers. That's not the most interesting thing about the Hadza. The most interesting thing about the Hadza is something called the Apem. Now, the Apem is a dance, and it basically works like this. So once a month, when the moon is gone from the sky in the evening and it's pitch black, the Hadza will gather together with other Hadza who are camping nearby, and the men and women separate, and the men go and hide normally behind some nearby trees. And the first man comes out and he's wearing a headdress of black ostrich feathers, and he's got a black cape, and he's holding a rattle, and he's got bells around one leg, and he leads off in a rhythmic dance. And then the women join in, normally children, often children will join, until pretty much everyone is dancing. And the Apem will last for sort of 2 or 3 hours, with different men taking turns to lead off the dance. Now, what is the point of the Apem? It serves no obvious purpose in the Hadza's life. It doesn't help them to hunt, it doesn't help them to gather, it doesn't resolve disputes, they don't have a particular hierarchy that it helps with, they don't have any organised religion or written down religious belief that it plays into. There's no obvious purpose that the Apem plays. And a group of anthropologists became so fascinated by this, they decided to follow the Hadza for a decade to try and work out what was the point of this dance. And what they decided to do was work out, who do the Hadza trust? Who are they prepared to camp near to? Who are they prepared to gossip with? Who do they share tools with? Who do they spend their time with? And they found the Hadza tended to trust 2 particular types of other Hadza. First of all, they had a bias towards trusting people in their own little family. So to an outsider, the Hadza may look like just like one group, but actually there's a number of smaller families that make up the Hadza. So the first bias was to people like them, people in their smaller family group. But the second bias was different. It was a bias towards people they danced the Apem with. And actually, the Hadza were more biased in their trusting, in their sharing, in their spending time with people they danced the Apem with than they were to members of their own family. What the Apem did is it connected the Hadza together across lines that they saw as lines of difference, and it created trust between them. Now, we don't have a term in the English language for an institution like that, institution that pulls people together, builds trust, and helps people to cooperate. We should have a term, because it's a really important thing. I suggest we call it the common life. So the Hadza had a common life, it was the Apem. And what's interesting is, if you look at the history of humanity, you can find the common life all over the place. So pretty much all hunter-gatherer tribes have something like the Apem to connect them together. When we stopped being foragers, we became farmers, and most farming societies had a different set of common life that brought them together. They had often religious services or rites of passage or feast days. And these were a really big deal. So an English person in the 15th century would spend 1 in every 5 days in a feast day or some sort of religious ceremony. Why? Because it connected them together between people who they might see in their village as a bit different and bonded them. When we moved from being farmers to being factory workers, we had a different common life based around clubs and societies that sprung up out of nowhere, based around this crazy invention that hadn't existed before, of the school, the mandatory school that everyone had to send their children to, which wasn't required by law before the end of the 19th century. And also this other new invention, the workplace. And the workplace, the club and society and the school became a new common life, connecting people together. The reason we've become more divided is because those common life institutions that connected our grandparents, our great-grandparents, some of our great-great-grandparents together have withered away or changed. And so every single generation since the war, since the Second World War, it has become less likely than the previous one to join a club, to join a society. Someone born in 1980 was half as likely to join a club than someone born in 1940. Our schools and our workplaces, most of us still, if we're the right age, go to school or go to work. But increasingly, we find we're spending time with people who are quite similar to us. Our schools, increasingly, people are educated with people at the same income bracket, the same education level. And increasingly, that's true in the workplace as well. So we've lost something. We've lost this common life. It hasn't gone completely, but it's declined. And we shouldn't be surprised that in its absence, various problems follow. A fractured society is one where young people lack the networks that they need to get ahead, particularly if they're from more disadvantaged backgrounds. A fractured society is one where democracy starts to have problems because people don't understand each other well and some leaders take advantage. A fractured society is one where people get more anxious and worried about the other and think someone might be up to something and after them. So these fractures matter. What do we do about it? How do we fix it? Well, this is where I think so many of us on this call can see some of what needs to be done, which is actually creating spaces that connect and bond people together. But we've often been really bad at funding that sort of activity or being really clear about how important it is. And so let me just close with saying exactly what it is that we need more of and how it works. And to do that, I'm going to tell one final story, which is the story of how Adolf Hitler desegregated the American army. So how was it that Hitler led to servicemen of all different racial backgrounds serving together? Seems like an extraordinary claim. Well, in 1944, near the end of the Second World War, on December the 16th at 5:30 in the morning, something completely crazy happened. This was near the end of the Second World War. The Allied forces have landed in France. They're sweeping through France rapidly, and it looks like this is going to be the end of the war in Europe pretty quickly. Hitler and the Nazis are increasingly cut off and surrounded by the Allied advance in the West, and the Russians are coming in from the East. And as was so often the case in these circumstances, Hitler decided to roll the dice and do something that seemed to his generals completely crazy. And what he decided to do was gather as many men as he could possibly get available and attack in one particular place the Allied supply line. The Allied had advanced so quickly through France that the supply line had got very spread. And actually there was a gap, there was a vulnerability available to be attacked just near Belgium. And so Hitler gathered, overruling his generals, he gathered 466,000 men and commanded them to attack the Allied supply line. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. And the Allies were caught by surprise. It was such a crazy thing to do. They didn't see it coming. And they began to take heavy losses. And it looked like the attack was going to work. Eisenhower was the man in charge of the Allied forces in Europe. And he instructed that as many men as possible must get to the front and must defend the supply line. And they threw more and more men to the front until there were no more men to throw to the front. And Eisenhower said there must be more people to be thrown to the front line. Who is there? And eventually his senior officers admitted there were a number of men who had been trained, Americans trained, who had not been deployed to the front line. And Eisenhower threw up his arms. This is ridiculous. They must be deployed. Why have they not been deployed? The reason they're not being deployed was because they were black. And the American army was segregated in the same way that the southern states were at the time. And so it was not allowed for black and white servicemen to fight together. And if white servicemen were fighting at the front, black servicemen could not. And on that day, in December 1944, Eisenhower said to hell with this ridiculous rule and sent out a command that any black men who had been trained, who wanted to fight on the front line, would be accepted into those battalions on the front line immediately. And sure enough, a number of incredibly courageous men fought. Many of them survived, some lost their lives for the future of Europe. A number of years later, the decision was taken by the President of the United States that the army should be desegregated, that black and white servicemen should no longer be trained and be fighting separately. And a survey was done of white servicemen to see how they would respond to such a change. The vast majority were opposed. 70% of white servicemen said they wouldn't want the army to be integrated in this way. Apart from one group of men, there were one group of white servicemen who had a completely different view. And for those men, 93% of them were in favour of the rapid integration of the black and white servicemen. Those men were the men who had fought at the front line of the Battle of the Bulge alongside their black fellow countrymen. And they knew that they had more in common than that which divided them. The reason I tell this story is what changed those people's minds, what brought a sense of connection and unity at a time of great division across the world, was not talks like this, was not lectures, was not academic research. It was the experience of doing something together. And admittedly, it was a particularly unique thing they were doing. But there's some really important lessons to take from it. Firstly, there was equality of status for those men. Back in the United States, black and white men were treated very differently. But there, they were wearing the same uniform, they were sleeping in the same trenches, they were fighting alongside each other, they were following the same commands. There was also an intensity of experience. If you look at the append, the dance that the Hadza do, again, there's an equality of status. You're not picked. It's not the best dancers, everyone dances, but also it's an intense experience. You'll remember what happened. And obviously a battlefront experience is intense. And the final thing is it involved routine. There were certain routines that had to be followed. And all the research that's been done in this area shows that those are the three things that really matter. Equality of status, intensity of the shared experience, and of routine. Routinization has this amazing impact on us. We know what needs to be done to try and give young people and all people these connections. It's time we push much harder to try and do more of these things. Nathan, over to you.
Jon, thank you very much. Before you, and I understand you have another engagement, so thank you very much for squeezing us in. Can I ask you one question before you have to fly it? During and your book mentioned actually about I'm never quite sure how to refer to this, the benefit of the clap, the NHS clap during COVID, in terms of something that brought us together. But do you feel that COVID caused that division to grow or to shrink within the UK?
Yeah, I think the pandemic is super complicated on this. There's a sort of apocryphal story of the leader of China being asked in roughly the year 2000 what he thought the impact of the French Revolution was, and responding that it was too early to say. I think there's a sort of element of that around the pandemic. Like it's not over yet, and we still don't quite know what the impact was on a lot of things. I think a couple of things. I think the best way that we're going to cross divides is through designing things that don't allow us that much choice about who we spend our time with. The more choice we have, the more we have this small bias, people like me syndrome, the more we tend to pick people like us, even though we don't necessarily mean to. And so if you look at the pandemic, one of the things that was in a small scale positive where it happened, those little WhatsApp groups that didn't happen on my street. I'm not trying to say it happened everywhere, but those little WhatsApp groups in some streets were good because generally it wasn't, oh, who should we put on this? Or I like them, I like them, I like them. It was more, we'll get everyone on the street. It's not perfect because our streets are still divided. They're definitely richer and poorer streets, so it's not perfect, but it was quite a good example of some of this in practice. The negative was a lot of the institutions that we got used to meeting and mixing in got disrupted. And so that's a problem. I think the question is, how do we take the opportunity? Where are the social investment funds out there trying to say, where's the next common life coming from? Firstly, how do we revitalize the ones we've got? Clubs and societies, getting schools more mixed again, thinking about opening up our workplaces and fair hiring. But also who's working out how we use online to actually bring people who might see each other as different together and build that connection.
Brilliant. Jon, thank you very much. I really appreciate you giving the time. And I want to bring Sarah in. Sarah is one of the young people, one of our young ambassadors, in fact. And Sarah, let's see if you appear on screen.
Hi.
There we go. You're on mute at the moment. Wonderful. Oh, I heard you and then you disappeared. Sarah, I've got a few questions for you, which I want to link to kind of how you were introduced to your mentor. And then we'll link, I know that we'll link back to kind of the positive activities that form perhaps part of the kind of common life that Jon's talking about. So Sarah, when did you meet your mentor? When were you introduced?
I was introduced to my mentor in 2019. through my school. I did
Okay.
an activity with Nick Brewer. It was a mental health campaign or something like that.
Okay, so you saw that video that we played at the beginning. That's the start of our workshops, and we run a workshop based on that. Why did you want or need a mentor?
I think my school recommended it to me just because I was struggling at school with my mental health due to like personal experiences, and I didn't really enjoy counseling. It wasn't that personal, so I think I just needed to build a friendship with my mentor rather than a more professional relationship.
That's interesting. That's a key point actually about kind of the role that perhaps youth workers play as opposed to kind of more professional or qualified clinicians. So you've been struggling, this was in year 11, right?
Yeah.
And you've been struggling with your mental health. You'd lost a friend under fairly grave circumstances.
Yeah.
So what happened to your friend?
So I think it was in 2018, 2019, my friend got stabbed by some people that were actually at my school in my year group, which and they kind of involved me into it, even though I wasn't like part of it. So that's when I was introduced to my mentor to kind of like explore my emotions because of that event.
Right, okay, and that would be pretty traumatic. I understand you weren't at the scene when the fatality happened, but because the young people that were involved in stabbing your friend were at your school, once you were associated with the victim, then that started to kind of tarnish you. And so how did that impact you kind of going to lessons and your kind of general mental health?
I just isolated myself, especially from the people at school, because I wasn't sure who I could trust with the information that I had to tell. So I just kind of leaned towards making more friendships with adults, especially like my mentor, who kind of understood what I went through because she had similar experiences.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. And I'm glad that your mentor could help you so they were relatable. And actually, I want to bring Ethan in. So, Sarah, thank you very much for sharing with us. Ethan, you also had a mentor. Why did you want a mentor?
I think it was a couple of years ago. I was very anxious and very down in myself, and it was leading me to pathways which I didn't think I could really get out of.
And did that impact your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was having suicidal thoughts, thinking that I'd no way out and it would be the only way. So I kind of needed someone to talk to, but I just didn't know how to ask.
Yeah, gosh, that's horrible. And how did that impact you going to school?
I was very anxious in my travel, being around a lot of people, especially due to COVID times. There was something about me that I just wanted to be alone while I was moving around everywhere, and especially with all the news of people getting stabbed, etc. It just wasn't really sitting with me perfectly.
And how did your mentor help you?
Me and my mentor, our relationship clicked almost instantly because we had the same hobbies, same interests, and it just meant I could actually talk to someone who would understand me a little bit better.
Brilliant. Cool. That's fantastic. And how are you doing now?
I'm doing really well. I'm working. I'm attending college regularly and actually making it on time, which is a big plus.
Good. Well done. Well done. And Ethan actually works at the gym where I swim occasionally. So that's fantastic. Well done, Ethan. I want to bring Amy in. Amy is one of our key contacts at one of the schools where we mentor. And Amy, I'm keen to hear from a school perspective, how has Switch Minds been beneficial for the young people in the school? Well, we can't hear you at the moment, Amy. It doesn't seem that you're on mute. Try again. My technical team are looking confused. I'm looking at them for advice. Yeah, no, it doesn't show that you're on mute. So there must be something with your microphone at your end, perhaps. Okay. What I propose we do is if we go to the video, and I don't know if while we're on video, we can try and sort out Amy's sound, or they're giving me a note. I can't read that, John, I'm afraid. So can we go to the video, and while we go to the video, see if we can sort out Amy's sound? And we hopefully come back to you, Amy.
After like a few weeks or so, it began to be a bit depressing, you know, because I couldn't get to see my friends, I couldn't get to see my family.
I was like, oh yeah, like I don't have to go to school and stuff because I really hated school. But then like further into it, like it got really, really bad for like my mental health and stuff.
It felt weird being at home so much, like.
I'd say I just kind of slept through it, like my mental health went really downhill. I could snap at anyone at any moment. I didn't know how to control it.
Playing my games on my PlayStation, like, helped me like put out all my anger into my games and all of that.
I think I was just afraid of how the world had changed in general.
Risk and danger has come into our own homes in a way that I certainly hadn't experienced that before. I think that the impact on young people's ways of seeing the world, ways of managing difficulty, relationships with their parents, relationships with themselves and their self-images have been hugely, hugely impacted. And we won't see, and I know lots of people say this, but we certainly won't even see the scale of it for many, many years, actually.
I'm seeing the effects of the past 2 years seem to be, you know, now displaying as there's more young people self-harming, there's more OCD, you know, there's more death anxiety.
Without being able to learn off teachers, we haven't been able to like get all the knowledge we could get. So say if like our grades slipped down a bit through lockdown, that could affect getting a job and stuff like that.
I like learning, I want to do good in life, so I kind of just wanted to be there, even though sometimes I say I hate school, but yeah, I think I've missed out on a lot.
I missed a lot of vital learning that I was supposed to learn during year 9 and a little bit of year 10. If lockdown wasn't there, then I probably would have experienced more as well.
My concern is that we will see young people who feel somehow that they failed because their year got the bad GCSE results and their year got the bad A-level results, and they start to see themselves as damaged, disturbed people, and that carries through into their lives.
For those young people that are already struggling, I don't think it's going to be, you know, a quick fix. I think the effects of it are going to be lasting, unfortunately.
I think what children need is their communities to function really well. Families and between teachers and pupils in communities, what clearly your organisation is most focused on, it's that is going to build up children's resilience rather than sort of that they're definitely in year 5 level maths or something.
Lifeland helps just by keeping in contact, and we also done a bit of like skating sessions, and I felt like that was good for me because it was a way for me to like spend time, and at least I was like out of the house and I was actually doing something active.
Some of the connections I've made about Lifeline, I would have never made them. And like some of the courses and qualifications I've gained about Lifeline, I would never have made them. Someone from my school put me on Lifeline. Those weekly phone calls were just basically something to look forward to. For me, when you're talking to a loved one, it's only to talk about how you feel, because you don't want them to know that you feel like that. But then, or that they turn back and feel like they're not doing enough. But speaking to that one person was probably like the best thing in the world.
It's very different, isn't it? It gives a very, very different perspective on the world and on yourself and on mortality. I think 10-year-olds, for example, are a terrible age because really they're very engaged now in the world, but they're not old enough to feel okay about it. And I think teenagers also, it's not ideal, is it? Because then they just feel very unsafe, and it's hard to take comfort from your parents because you're also busy telling your parents that they're wrong about everything. So
during during the lockdown, I kind of became like a bit more calm and relaxed generally.
Kind of gave me a lot of time to self-reflect on myself and like see how I could change.
That improved myself in ways that I thought weren't possible.
Right, let's see if Amy's sound is working, or not sound, but the microphone. Amy, can I hear you?
Yeah, I've tried a different technology. Is that better?
Wonderful. I've got you. Yes. Sorry, I raised my hands in excitement. Wonderful. So we've heard a little bit about the young people in terms of how the Switch program impacts them. Could you share with us from a school perspective the impact that you think it has on the students and the school?
It was amazing hearing Sarah and Ethan talk, because I suppose that is the end of the journey. And where a school is, we pick students up at the beginning, and what Switching Minds does, and the programme that I've engaged with, and we've been sort of supporters and co-workers with Lifeline for around the last 10 years, is we have a catalogue of provision in Joe Richardson, because not everything fits everybody, but our ethos and our motto is success for all. And what we have to have at our fingertips is a range of options so that everybody feels that they've got a champion. And every child should have a champion, because if you look at sort of the tagline of Bernardo's, every childhood's worth fighting for. And what Lifeline gives us is really that time, because some of our children, their lives are hard, but they wouldn't meet the threshold for CAMS, because it isn't mental health, it is low mood and it is anxiety, and it is all the sort of early signs of, if we don't get on top of this, this could manifest into something much more concerning and much more worrying. And what our job is to early intervention, to get in early, to spot the students who need it, just like Sarah and Ethan's school clearly did very successfully, and put an intervention in place that will help them. And going back to everything that we've heard in the presentations, it is about people like me, and it's about connections and routines and relationships and continuous positive regard for that child and that student. And that's exactly what Lifeline does. It picks students up before they even realise really that they need it. And they work with them and they guide them and they help them and they do counsel them in a non sort of oppressive way, that the student feels like they've got somebody who's got the back. And the best example I can give of this is, I remember being in my garden in the summer holidays, talking to Nathan about a student who we'd been watching for a while, and we knew there was a disclosure pending, and it was to the Lifeline worker that she did it, because she felt comfortable and she felt that you are my person and you've got me. And that's exactly what Lifeline does in our school. It doesn't work for everybody, and the sort of process that you go through to make sure you get the right person on the right pathway, Lifeline are really strict. And it's often I'll be like, could you just consider this? No, have they been through the workshops? Have we got a referral form? And that's really good, because the work that they do has a clear entrance and exit point, and it really sort of guides the students through the period of time where they really, really need somebody. And, you know, it's methodical, it's well structured, and it really is successful, because I say it in nearly every meeting I go to, I am not a fan of professional activity for the sake of it. If an intervention is going to be given to one of our students, it has to be the exact high quality intervention that will see them through the sort of time that they need it, rather than just me ticking a list in, yeah, I've tried that. And that's exactly what Switching Minds has done for us.
Amy, thank you very much. I really appreciate that feedback. And it's so important to get that school's perspective. In one sentence, could you say what the impact would be if you didn't have the service of Switch Minds?
The impact would be, there'd be a group of students, and just interestingly, I've got the statistics. At the moment, you're sort of working with 10 students, and I've had a look at them, and as it's turned out, they're all female. And there would be a gap in my sort of YES project, in my planned provision for students, targeted planned provision for students. I'd have a gap. CAMS would wouldn't fill it, my other interventions wouldn't fill it, and then I would worry that the students wouldn't get the support that they needed and they would find support in other ways. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but would that look like an increase in self-harm? Would it look like an increase in really severe anxiety? And would it look like an increase in school non-attendance? I would say yes, because they don't feel like they've got a person, and I wouldn't have a route to signpost them to. And then would they fall out of the system potentially? And that would be really sad.
Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate that. And I want to, we've got a panel of experts here today. We've got Professor Jim McManus, who's the President of the Association of Directors of Public Health, as well as the Director for Public Health in Hertfordshire. And I'm pleased to say that April Bald has also joined us, who's the Operations Director for Children's Care and Support in Barking and Dagenham, as well as Trevor Cook, who's the Assistant Director of Education in Havering since 2018, apparently, but working in Havering and education for much longer than that. And Jim, I'm going to put the first question to you. I know that you have to go for a meeting with someone rather high profile as part of one of your other responsibilities. So one of the things that Dr. Sarah Parker said is that we won't see the scale of COVID for many years to come. What do you think is the long-term impact of COVID on young people that you are most concerned about? Oh, sorry, Jim, you're on mute.
Had to be somebody, didn't there, do that? I guess I'm probably concerned about a series of impacts. I think there's no single impact. So if you look at the short-term impact, there's the kind of trauma and the grief and the loss of contact. I think the change to educational outcomes will be medium to longer term, but it's still very, and actually making sense of it. And also the example we as adults have given our young people of level of social aggro, missing conspiracy theories, that does have an impact on young people. There's lots of scientific studies there. So I think the impacts will be multiple. I think they will appear in quite a lot of mental health issues. There's also the impacts of kids who've had COVID, who have developed problems with eating since having COVID, partly because of changes in taste that haven't gone unrecognised, but partly because we need to recognise COVID has been a significant collective trauma. For some people, grief has turned into grievance. And I think we've done a bad job of being role models for our children and young people in some places. The opposite side of the coin from that is there is massive amounts of scientific evidence that says, basically backs up what Sarah and Ethan were saying, that people you can identify with actually have a significantly positive effect on your development and your well-being, to the point where people can avoid needing clinical levels of services. So mentoring, for example, as well as being, having someone, aspects of his identity you share. Ethan talked powerfully about identifying with his mentor. There's lots of scientific evidence that helps. So what we can do is we can start to build an economy of support from low-level things like just befriending, right up through peer mentoring, right up to formal mental health support, as well as the educational support. And those are important things, I think, in building back. The other thing we should say is that this virus has not been equal. It has affected people in poorer populations and people in Black populations and more recent immigrants to the UK, like Eastern Europeans, in a much worse way than it has affected wealthy white people. So Barking and Dagenham, I think the number of people who can work from home is around 20%. Richmond-on-Thames, the other side of London, it's about 78%. So the impact has been unfair. There's a really good guide published by a guy called Professor Jonathan Campion on the kind of things local authorities and the NHS can do around building that network of support.
I think that might be a good, sorry to cut you off, Jim, that's very interesting. And I think that might be a good segue to hear from April, as she's happened to come up on the screen first, about what kind of how local authorities are responding to the situation. And Trevor, don't worry, I'm going to come to you next with that same question.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Some fascinating insights today, and hearing collectively from everyone. I was sort of taking myself back almost 2 years to when this first happened, and how, as an authority, how it became a very much all hands on deck. I remember the BD Can, sort of all the local voluntary agent sector coming together with the council and saying, let's work together. We've got to help our most neediest. And we know, like Jim said, Berkshire and Dagenham has really high level of need. So we were seeing working with local supermarkets, food banks being put in place, delivering people their medication. The government helpfully, DfE helpfully sort of volunteered the offer of giving us some laptops for our children. And we found ourselves, well, that just gets you over the first hurdle. The second hurdle was the setup. We have huge digital poverty in Berkshire and Dagenham. What about the Wi-Fi connection? What about the maintenance of those laptops? So it was really joining forces with our schools, so councils, together with our school community, and how we're going to work together to support families to get those laptops, to set them up at a time where we were all in huge lockdown. So really tough times to navigate. And I've worked really closely with the likes of Amy and all her colleagues across other schools in keeping an eye. How do we keep an eye on our vulnerable children when we're in lockdown, when people aren't supposed to be seeing each other? How do I get my workforce, social workers, to feel confident to walk into people's homes when everyone's so scared and we knew so little about the seriousness of the virus? We've heard awful stories about young Arthur and Star and the national press who died during this time because the risk was not being seen, because we were doing virtual visits, for example. So we had to think about how do we do safe visiting for our staff. So there was a lot of work being done around, giving them the correct staff, the workforce correct PPE, and giving them the best advice from public health on safe interactions. But what we saw, Nathan, is, we talk about the risks, and, Ethan and Sarah sort of, really eloquently described some of those outcomes of how it impacted on them. But what we saw is more and more children, because they were spending more time online, being more at risk of grooming. And we have seen sexual abuse and sexual exploitation on the rise, certainly since the lockdown. So that's an added sort of area that we've had to look at. I know you and I, we were talking right through the pandemic, weren't we? Because I couldn't rely just on my workers being able to see the children. We needed the likes of Lifeland to come on board, and you were saying, how can we do it? How can we get out there? I said, take them out to play football. We allowed like 2 people in a park, 2 meters apart. You can play football. Let's think creatively. Let's think out the box, and like John said, let's find that commonality. How kids just can have that time to do things they want to do, and in a non sort of threatening, non-oppressive way, as Amy pointed out, using music, using arts, using sport to help engage children and just be with them during what were really challenging times.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think young people come back to time and time again, they just need that person to talk to, and actually having that support that meant that we could be seen as key workers. And I'm pleased that government recognised that the role that organisations like Lifeline play. And that was the same actually for our work in Havering as well. And Trevor, keen to hear kind of how Havering was responding to some of the situations there, and perhaps some of the fears about the long-term impact of COVID, but more about kind of how you kind of responded in those situations.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. And can I start by thanking Sarah and Ethan as well for their contributions? You know, really, really brave to share their sort of journey, really. So I just wanted to start off with that. But yeah, from our perspective, I remember speaking to one of Jim's colleagues, our own Director of Public Health, sort of almost this time 2 years ago. And him telling me that the sort of a pandemic of this nature would be at least 2 years. And I remember thinking, no chance, you know, we'll have this done and dusted in a few months. And here we are 2 years on, sort of still working collaboratively across the system, you know, to support children and young people to make sure that they aren't disadvantaged. Similar to April's comments, you know, I've been very, very proud locally to lead on the response from the local authority to our education and childcare settings. Lots and lots of meetings, you know, lots and lots of very, very key operational stuff, as April mentioned there, about making sure that children could attend safely in our schools. But very quickly, the focus came on to the recovery and making sure that schools and colleagues like Amy's, you kind of were equipped with everything they needed to have in their armoury to support children in their continuation of that face-to-face education, but also making sure they weren't disadvantaged. Interestingly, what we were hearing, and we were very keen to approach this, what we didn't want was the narrative become self-fulfilling, you know. And I heard terrible terms such as like a furlough generation or the COVID generation, you know, of young people. And I'll declare an interest here with a daughter who was first affected by that cohort, and she's busy doing her A-level preparation now, you know. So I'll declare a self-interest there. But what we found was that actually there was some really, really positive stories that were coming out from young people, because what they are, young people, as we all know, are very, very resilient. You know, it's been very challenging, and certainly young people have had to face more adversity than many of us will ever have expected. But what we found is that many young people actually found their own groups, and this idea of the kind of sort of, as we describe it locally, their own tribe. You know, whether that was, we had examples of one young lady in one of our schools that was really interested in science and technology, and so she created a STEM group because she identified that STEM was really poorly thought of in her home country of Kosovo. You know, others that kind of come together to focus on their own mental health and well-being, and they began to find their own tribes through the kind of medium of Zoom and other sort of platforms. But we're really encouraged to kind of promote and publicize the sort of good things that young people were sort of achieving and through this pandemic. But like April said, making sure that our most vulnerable children, young people and families didn't fall through the net, you know, and those protections were put in place, and we're absolutely prioritizing them for face-to-face learning. And certainly that continues to be our focus now as we sort of look to the future, you know, because whilst we're hopefully seeing the end of this particular wave, you know, I think as your earlier speaker John said, we're going to see the effect of this particular pandemic for many years to come. So we need to make sure that young people's aspirations aren't damaged permanently through this.
Thanks, Trevor. I just need to give Jim's apologies. He'd alerted me beforehand that he had to go for a meeting with the Secretary of State for Health, as he sits on SAGE, the government's advisory group for COVID. So he'd been called in at late notice to that meeting, so I had to pop off. He's hoping to come back to us. We'll see if we're still rolling at that point. I've got a question from the audience from Lorraine in Redbridge. Is asking, in Redbridge they have a youth council. Is it the same for the boroughs of Barking, Dagenham and Havering?
Yes, we've got one that sort of, and for the wider school population, young people population, and then we have one for our children looked after. And actually, you know, when we're thinking about how we move forward, or also how we've sort of managed during the pandemic, it has been about asking young people themselves, collaboration. We can't do it without them, involving them at you know, every stage and in key decisions that we're making. We've just, for example, a survey's gone out to, you know, the Children's Council to ask their experiences of risk within schools, risk in their communities, and what's worrying them the most. And I know our health colleagues actually also led on a few surveys with young people during the pandemic, so we could keep an eye on what was worrying them most, and then that would inform some of our commissioning and some of our responses sort of collectively. Wonderful. Across health.
Yeah, brilliant. And Trevor in Havering?
Yep, exactly the same as April's description there. We've got an active youth council local and children in care councillors as well, and same as in Barking and Dagenham, a real focus on ours is to make sure the kind of voice of the young people, you know, is integral as possible to our decision making, and very, very grateful for the time they spend. And we know, and I think there's some Havering colleagues on the call, one of the more exciting corporate parenting meetings is when the young people take over, you know, and it's their agenda and their meeting. Not that the other meetings aren't equally as exciting, but that's a particular highlight.
Yeah, and actually, Lorraine, for Lifeline, so we're mentoring in schools across 3 boroughs and beyond, and we have a group of ambassadors, and that's who Ethan and Sarah have come through the program and then been trained to be ambassadors, and they help us with recruitment, with program planning, with peer mentoring, running events. One of our ambassadors, who I might mention later, comes to one of the activities and sets up. And actually, April, you mentioned about activities, and Trevor, you mentioned about tribes. And that's one of the things that Sarah spoke about, the impact of going to an activity and how that activity was beneficial for her. But actually, it's that social gathering that during lockdown we've seen an impact for, and something that I think is really important for young people. But one of the other things that Dr. Sarah Parker said is that it's families, teachers and communities that build resilience, rather than knowing you've got a level 4 or level 5, I think she said, in maths, and that you're working at that appropriate level. And it seems to me the government's put this focus on tutoring and catching up academically, but I'm concerned they may be missing the need to help people build resilience and catch up emotionally. Have you got any thoughts in regard to that? Either one can go first.
I'm going to leave that to Trevor to start first, given he's in the education world, so he probably has something a bit more insightful than me, but I can come on the back of that.
I'm not sure about that, April, but I'll give it a go. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Nathan. And we debated quite early on in Havering about the terminology, you know, because, you know, a lot of the talk early on was recovery, you know, and we debated, well, actually recovering from and to what, you know, and so we were very clear, and our school leaders were very clear that actually they're educators, you know, they will deal with the child that's lost a few levels in maths or English and needs to be a bit work on phonics, you know, that is their day job. But what they were very clear on is actually there's a group of young people that have lost out, and I'll use the description of a kind of cultural capital, you know, those other experiences that you would just take for granted. You know, we reflected that there was a whole year group had gone through probably without learning to swim, you know, go along to the local swimming pool, you know, the opportunity to go and visit the local museum or go up into London to kind of take advantage of the kind of rich cultural opportunities that are up there. So that's been quite a large focus of our schools as part of their, I'll call it recovery, you know, approach in for young people, is to make sure that actually their mental health and their well-being was addressed first, because the educational catch-up will happen, you know, later. So absolutely making sure that young people felt safe and secure as they come back into that face-to-face education. And it was mixed. You know, some come back really, really positively, couldn't wait to come back to school. Others, actually, what we did find was that when there were those periods when it was only sort of smaller groups going into school, that were generally the more sort of vulnerable pupils, actually they were quite concerned about the larger group of pupils coming back to school. So schools have had to manage that dynamic within that return back. But certainly our approach hasn't been just solely focused on the academic sort of programs. Actually, you've got to look at sort of making sure that all the children's needs are catered for and addressed.
Yeah.
And one of the things that that Jim spoke about, I think, was the non-clinical relationships, which will kind of relate to perhaps some of that more mentoring. April, we're keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that word recovery. I think at one stage we were saying the new normal, but and how we move forward. I cannot think of a conversation that I've had with my education director where she is not talking about, you know, the approach to supporting children with and young people with building resilience and overcoming some of the, you know, the impact of on their emotional well-being. It is absolutely hand in hand with their helping them catch up with their education. The concern has actually been our most vulnerable or deprived children being significantly further behind in their education than the sort of more affluent counterparts. But no, and I'm sure Amy would concur that, you know, for the longest time, education has felt like teachers are doing both. They're educating, but they're also thinking about the children and their well-being, and they've been trained up in trauma-informed approaches, etc. In terms of what was your question there, that last bit, Nathan? You're saying about
in terms of so this is about really on the thing about resilience,
Okay.
rather than just focusing on the academic side,
Yeah.
and helping
Mhm.
young people build that resilience.
Yeah, I think very much that, you know, when we are meeting, like I say, when we're meeting with our education partners in schools, or even, you know, my colleague and as an education director, the conversations span across both. We don't think about one without the other, because without the resilience and without that emotional support, they can't access education. And can't thrive, you know, in terms of the educational sort of achievements. So yeah, I feel confident that the focus, and that's where we need to think about, you know, like Amy said, what are the different options that we have available, and what are we prioritizing funding in a time where funding is not as easily accessible, and in a time where the need is so much higher.
Yeah, it's those two things, isn't it? It's funding's not as accessible and the need being higher. And I think one of the things that that Jon spoke about was the common life. And it's interesting, Jon mentioned, in fact, I mentioned in his intro that he was at McKinsey. Well, we had a consultant from McKinsey work with a group of young people about 15 years ago. And one of the phrases that the young people came up with was about what makes good youth work and friendships is when you make memories together. So we've sought to embed into our programs opportunities where we encourage social interaction by helping young people make memories. And some of those things might be the activities that we do. But I think that helps create community. And that's a lot of what young people need. And the message that's come through the video that we saw is that young people feel that they've come through it. They've learned new things about themselves, but they still need help. And at Lifeline, we're big on community and helping young people. How do you think, from a local authority perspective, you can help to build help the community to help the young people within it? Trevor.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. It's interesting because as you asked the question, I was reflecting back on the impact of the last couple of years, because, and I think Jon gave the example, didn't he, of kind of community coming together, you know, to support each other, and he gave the example of the street, and I've got exactly the same in our local network, and I've seen that in schools actually. So I've seen groups of schools come together as a community in a way that probably we wouldn't have seen before, you know, focused on their locality, you know, so we have clusters of schools that are serving similar communities, and they've come together in a way that we hadn't seen previously. And we've seen communities around schools again come together. I mean, we've only got to look at the approaches very early on, you know, around supporting families, households that were shielding. You know, we saw school leaders and other school staff visiting, doing welfare checks, dropping off food parcels, all those sort of things that help develop that trust of community. And interesting, when Jon was speaking and he spoke about common life, in my notes here, I wrote down straight away school ? And then he later referred to kind of the notion of the school being that kind of common life, because it is absolutely that, isn't it? And we know where things work best, and Ethan and Sarah had spoke about this, is where the relationship of trust, you know, that adult, that champion, I think other colleagues have mentioned about, is absolutely there. And I think you get that within schools, don't you? Where it works less well is when that trust is broken down, you know, and that's when organisations like Lifeline and others can come in, you know, to help kind of repair some of that trust, or somebody else champion on behalf of the child or young people. So I've actually seen a strengthening of that community and the community feel, you know, in that locality, in and around our school areas, you know, and more examples than anyone could ever sort of mention, you know, of kind of real localized projects and things coming together, you know, to support children and families.
That idea of trust breaking down, and that I think you're right, schools can be a great place, but when that trust breaks down, it can be quite catastrophic. April, have you got thoughts about kind of responses when trust is broken down, both for young people in a school setting, but also young people in a care setting? I know the breakdown of placement is always a significant issue, and you're talking about some, you know, young people that have a really, I mean, the most challenging start in life. Have you got thoughts about what can be done to help rebuild trust?
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm loving the terms common life, creating memories, and a term that we're using in Dagenham is hopeful disruptions. And I'll come on to sort of that, and it links up with the trust question. It's all about how we are engaging the community, the wider community, parents and carers of our young people, as well as our young people. You will know, Nathan, we've been working with yourself and others in the social sector, coming together with social care to look at how we can jointly tackle the issue of exploitation of young people. So finding common language, building the trust between sort of local authority and social sector, and finding that commonality. You know, we've in Dagenham, we've had like the Lost Hours campaign, which is our way to reach out to parents and carers to help engage them in thinking about the risks their children are at when they're outside the home. We've got also an organisation that's working in partnership with us called Town Culture, and this is where it's a great example, very much like the work Lifeline is doing, of finding that way of engaging young people where the trust is broken down, and through the use of artists. So it's bringing artists and social work together, and through art engaging children. So social workers learning how to use art tools to engage young people. So we have artists, whether they're artists who draw, artists who play music, artists within the kitchen, have great culinary skills, but using those mediums to bring children together and find a common ground. And we've done some really good work with unaccompanied groups of unaccompanied minors, children in care leavers who are often, like you say, lost faith in the local authority or in the corporate parent, and they're looking for somewhere to belong, and somewhere where they feel like kind of they can fix some of that, you know, sort of change some of that fixed narrative that we tend to they tend to have developed around their lives because they've been in the care system so long. And, you know, we've also got the Youth at Risk Matrix, who work really closely with the schools and find a way of engaging young people using, for example, music. I know they've had done some work recently at the Amy School on clean drill. So teaching children, you know, who enjoy listening to drill, but thinking about the more positive sides of it and how you can make that a positive experience. So again, hopeful disruption, how we can sort of disrupt some of the negatives, whether it's the trust or the sort of dangerous behaviors or dangerous situations they find themselves in, with positive activities. So those are just some examples.
That's fantastic. We've got time for one last question. And one of the things that we've spoken to young people about and have an ongoing dialogue is about their thoughts around crime. Most of them have been affected by youth crime and fear it. And so the actuality and the fear are significant. But actually, when you speak to a lot of young people, a lot of them have had close experiences, actual experiences of crime. Most young people don't think things will change unless we fund more projects and open more youth centres. And I think that the child's voice is very important. When I spoke with some young people before Christmas about our mentoring, they said, well, yeah, it's good, but we really want it for 2 or 3 hours, not half an hour, and we want it 2 times a week, not once a week. But you know, young people say they want more projects and they want more youth centres. Do you think they're correct, April?
Yes. Yeah. I think we've been equally saying that for a long time. And, you know, embarking in Dagenham, we were obviously really excited when Future Youth Zone opened up, you know, but we know that's the one. And, you know, so it's more. Young people need positive outlets. They need to go somewhere where it's safe, where it's warm, where they can get food, where they can meet others, and, you know, have healthy sort of experiences and environments outside of school, outside of just the park, where we know that there are risks, and outside of the homes where sometimes it's not the best place to be. So yeah, I agree. And I know we had a discussion just yesterday, didn't we, Nathan, about, you know, what we can, how we would use our limited funding, but it needs more than just, you know, local authority funding. We need all to come together. But yeah, I think young people are absolutely right. That's part of the solution.
And Trevor, your thoughts? Are you going to be controversial?
No, the worst thing you could do is ask young people their opinion and then say they're wrong. Really, aren't they? They're absolutely right. But I think April's made the really key point that it isn't just the local authority. You know, it has to be the kind of wider public sector, public health, schools, education, community, third sector, private sector. Everyone needs to kind of come together in this because of the benefits to young people. Pre-pandemic, I had the privilege of visiting the On-Side Centre down at Beacon Tree, and it was just amazing. Yeah, it's absolutely packed out, full of young people participating in hopeful disruption. I think I love that phrase, you know, but really positive activities. That was an absolute distraction from some very, very challenging circumstances they had outside the doors of those centres, you know. So whether it's school, youth centres or others, we absolutely have to populate young people's lives with hopeful disruption and activities. You know, how we fund it is the $1 million question, and I'm sure April, like us and many others, are constantly lobbying our friends in local authority treasury offices, but also national treasury, to better fund activities for young people. You know, and I'm sure the young people on this call would absolutely champion that as well. So no, definitely won't get any disagreement from me on that one, Nathan.
Brilliant. April, final comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on terms of the funding, you know, this government is really good at sort of putting out lots of bids, you know, bid for this money. And I think we often can find ourselves competing for the same pot of money. And it's how we collectively across piece come together and bid for that money, and or agree first on what we want, and then collectively bid and best use it. I think there's a trick to be had there. And equally, you know, sort of how we do that cross borough. You know, our children move between Havering, Redbridge and Barking very freely. So it's how we work across the tri-borough to jointly commission and jointly fund initiatives for our young people. I think there's value in us trying to do that a bit more.
I think that tri-borough approach is really important, and we've been able to do a little bit more on that over the last few years, and found it really important. I want to give an opportunity if there's any questions from viewers, and I think they can put that into the now I've got a question here. Deborah asked, do you think schools are open to including emotional wellbeing and resilience workshops as opposed to academic topics? Perhaps Trevor, if you could answer that for me.
I'm happy to answer, but I feel guilty answering when we've got a real life school person in the. So Amy might want to comment as well. But from our perspective, absolutely, and the approach on emotional, mental health and well-being is absolutely a focus in Havering. So you might do something similar in Barking and Dagenham in Redbridge, but we fund a program called Emotional Literacy Support. So the idea is you absolutely don't just focus on the sort of academic side. You absolutely have to focus on the mental health and well-being aspects of a young person as well. Is equally as it's important. But Amy may wish to give us some real examples from a school's perspective.
Yeah, Amy, can you chip in?
Yeah, I suppose the best example would be the structure that we've got in our school, in the fact that there's 2 deputy heads. One deputy head does everything with them when they're on the stage. So if you imagine a performance, when we get the kids on the stage, that's their exams, the teaching and learning, everything. My whole purpose in this building is totally behind the scenes to make sure that they can get on the stage and they can perform. So they're absolutely open to emotional intelligence, resilience. We understand that if the kids aren't in the right mindset, they're never going to do the best. So my job is to work behind the scenes with every single one, know every single one inside out, know what makes them tick, provide services to help them, and we do a fit for school assessment every single day for that exact reason, because you know, some of our children, sadly, it's an absolute miracle that they manage to sit on a seat, and they're here and they're with us for 8 hours a day. So let's do our thing with them so that they can do the best they possibly can as and when they need to.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Amy. That's really helpful. What I want to do now is just share some of the impact that we've had, particularly through the Switch Minds program over the last little while. And I've got a presentation I'm just going to whip through as part of the kind of the closing comments. It's always risky that I select the right screen. Right, there we go. So talking about the impact. Mabinti is a young person that we worked with in our through Switch Minds. She was referred to Lifeline because she had high anxiety and was self-harming. She wasn't talking to anyone. And of her family, she said they don't understand and they're not so modern. And that gives a good interpretation as to some of the barriers that young people face in talking to their family. And I like the way that Dr. Sarah Parker spoke about teenagers are at a difficult age because they're too busy telling their parents they're wrong about everything, that they can't receive the support from the parents that they might offer, particularly during COVID. And you can see that in the case with Mabinti. Mabinti had written in her diary that she doesn't want to be around anymore, but she was referred to mentoring, and she developed a really strong relationship with her mentor. But she started developing tics and seizures, and she had one of these seizures when she was at one of our positive activities that she was going to regularly, our skating program. Because she had the seizure there, it gave us a little bit more understanding, and we were able to work with the family who had not been aware of the situation that was going on. I hadn't taken it seriously. And so now I've been able to ensure that Mabinti sees her social worker and her GP, and get a specialist referral for the situation. As we do our mentoring, the thing that comes through time and time again is the sheer importance of the relationship with young people. And many years ago, a young person told me, I don't want any activities or services. All that I want is someone that cares about me, someone that's interested in my life. And that comes through time and time again. We've seen it in government policies over the last 20 years. That's what young people want. That's what they're interested in. So our approach in Lifeline is about prevention versus cure. It's easier to stop an avalanche happening or stop a snowball forming than to try and break it when it's formed. I had a friend from Sierra Leone here a number of years ago when we had that big snow, and we went and we made a big snowball at Hainault Forest, like it was like 6 foot high. It was actually the base of a snowman. And because snow's soft, he thought that he could run into this snowball and it would just fall apart. And he was quite a big guy, into the gym and such. Anyway, everyone was very amused as he was winded flat on his back, because actually snow gets very compact and it gets nigh impossible to break down. And I think that's where we look at prevention. Is much better than the cure. It's easier to stop it forming. One of the things that hopefully comes across is our approach to partnership. Working with schools is really important for us. They give access to young people who are kind of a captive audience. It means that we can save a lot of time from traveling around, and the sharing intelligence with both the school, with the parent and statutory services is really important. And we think that approach, both the mentoring and the positive activities that Mabinti accessed, is what contributes to our outcomes. Young people tell us that their behavior has improved significantly. In fact, let me see, where's the figure gone? About 70% of the time. and that they feel their attendance has improved 60% and their attitude has improved 70%. And currently we're working with schools to collect, to verify that data. But that's quite a strong result in what young people are telling us. One of the other interesting things is when we look at who we're working with on the Switch Minds program, 25% of those young people are known to social workers, about 25%, and someone used the phrase earlier, oh sorry, Amy used the phrase earlier about not meeting the CAMS threshold. And on our forms, it says about on the CAMS waiting list, but it might be more appropriate to describe that as young people that aren't meeting the CAMS threshold. And there still needs to be a service for those young people. And Amy spoke about the consequence if some of those young people don't get that service, a fear of increased self-harm, severe anxiety and non-attendance. And that was kind of echoed with, I think, some of the things that Jim was saying. What we do know is young people that access our program see between term 2 and term 3 a 10-point improvement on their Warwick-Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale. So we know that it has an impact. And this is at a time when young people were, in fact, the world was in a pandemic and wellbeing generally dropped, but young people with mentors actually experienced a significant improvement in wellbeing. And those figures move young people from being below average wellbeing to above average wellbeing. And someone from a below average wellbeing is more likely to need to access at a later stage other more expensive services. So we're really pleased that we've been able to deliver these programs. It's due to the dedication of our staff, and Amy spoke about a story of speaking in the summer holidays on the telephone to our team. It's about working in those partnerships where people are available and able to contribute is really important. So we really appreciate the dedication of our staff and the partners that we work with. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the presentation today. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, for your time today. We appreciate it. I'd like to thank our guests, our panel, the young people, Amy, for contributing, particularly Sarah and Ethan for sharing your stories, and for Jon for coming along and sharing his insight in this. And this video is being recorded, so if there's bits that you missed and you want to look again or you want to share with others, then please feel free to do that. That will come out through the emails that you registered with. That's it. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you once again. I'll see you soon.